Welcome to AP US History, and today we'll be talking about the reasons of the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, and what happened before it to really cause all of this to happen. One of the first things that came before the American Revolution was something known as the 7 Years' War, which really took 9 years. In America, it is known as the French and Indian War, so called because, well, the British were fighting the French, and the Indians, and not exactly liking the British because they didn't exactly treat them, or at least give them gifts in compensation for their land, sided with the French, so the Indians fought with the French, so it was known as the French and Indian War. Not exactly the most creative naming standard, but that is the official name for several hundred years. The British won this, and one of the downsides about winning this kind of war, though, is that it was very expensive. How expensive, you ask? Very, very expensive. Mostly, though, that was being funded through taxes by the British citizens. U.S. citizens don't exist yet. By the British citizens of the British Isle, which I believe looks something like this. But obviously, this was pretty unpopular at the time because, well, no one loves high taxes, and the British people were paying these for several years now. Well, more specifically, 9 years now. Probably less, but about 9 years. And since Parliament decided that they can't keep taxing British people that live on the mainland, or I suppose the main isle, they looked towards the colonies who, well, they were protecting. This didn't exactly sit well with all the 13 colonies that existed, that was owned by Britain at the time, mainly because A, they didn't exactly have a say in Parliament. They don't even have representatives to represent all the 13 states in Parliament. Two, they thought that the British really sucked at protecting them during the war. Sure, they won the war, but their armies, their original armies, were terrible for the dense forest land and other natural places of defenses that the Americans were well suited for, but the British were not very used to. As a result, they agreed, well, at least all 13 of them agreed, that A, their representatives should be the only ones who can decide whether they, the 13 colonies, should be taxed or not, and B, that didn't exist, so they were pretty angry. Especially when these taxes were implemented by British officers. So what they do in response? Number one, they throw tar and feathers at them, which made the British taxpayers the British tax collectors really scared. As a result, they didn't try to get the taxes, and King George III, this guy over here, was really mad. And it didn't help that, well, they had a bunch of tea dumped into the Boston Tea Party, into the Boston Harbor, which is now known as the place of Boston Tea Party. Well, yeah, they dumped apparently lots and lots of tea. And they dumped 340 chests of British East India Company tea, which is about 92,000 pounds, roughly 46 tons. Which in today's money was $1,700,000, because back then it was 9,659 pounds. This was during the time when 1 cent could literally buy you several things. No, sorry, not 1 cent. 5 cents could buy you several things. And today's money, $1,700,000. I'm pretty sure the U.S. national debt is way bigger than that. They literally even made a U.S. national debt clock, which apparently is under construction. But as you can see here, it is currently, well, it's always rising. It's not even in a million. It's not even in the trillion. It's not even the billions anymore. It's in the trillions. The U.S. currently owes about $37.3 trillion. And emphasis on the word trillion. In today's money, that was this much money destroyed. What do you think? You can see the immediate difference, can't you? Obviously, King George was not happy that the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, specifically the Sons of Liberty, dumped all that down there while being dressed as Indians. And at last, they went ahead and revoked the Stamp Act, which was the whole point of the Boston Tea Party. And they went ahead and, well, made another. They passed another bill that literally said this. It goes on the lines of we can tax you whatever we want. We have the power to tax whatever we want. We're not going to tax China because we don't want to, but we could if we wanted to. And then they did all the intolerable acts, which, as the name suggests, was very intolerable towards the U.S. citizens. Well, not the United States citizens, but the American citizens. like, I made a habit to call them US because I keep reading US history, but right now they're just Americans. Technically British subjects, not Americans yet. They haven't declared independence yet, but they're still Americans one way or another. Alas, this is how the American Revolution, happened. The Americans were pretty much losing in the war, mainly because, well, they didn't have a navy, and Britain literally had the biggest navy in the entire world at the time. But then the French were all like, okay, it sucks. We hate losing the 7 Years' War, which in reality check, by the way, lasted 9 years, not 7. Historians are really good at naming things, aren't they? And they wanted a little bit of revenge against the British, or their idea of revenge is kick the British off the land, or at least their certain colonies, which they worked so hard to protect. So they allied themselves with the Americans. Note that this is not back then in context related kind of flag. It's just a modern day flag. And as a result, the French went ahead and sided with the Americans, and well, this kind of mutual relationship started happening. The British, like originally the French were pretty up for all this, but then they realized how much it was going to cost them, so they quickly ended things up. Things really didn't work very well for the Americans, at least. General George Washington literally had a bunch of starving American soldiers, so-called American soldiers, who weren't properly trained. It wasn't until the French came that they were properly trained and shaped up, and could do this magnificent crossing of the Delaware, which probably doesn't look as glorious as the painting makes it look. The only reason why it worked was because all the Germans were drunk. That's all I could say. And most of them can't speak the same languages. Like, the British would rather send another country's soldiers to fight rather than, their own citizens. And then the Declaration of Independence was, published. It was written on July 2nd of 1776, and John Adams famously said in a letter to his wife on July 3rd of 1776, the second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations by the great anniversary festival. Note why we celebrate it on July 4th instead of, say, July 2nd is because, the Declaration of Independence was ratified by Congress, whatever Congress they had, at least 9 out of the 13 states on July 4th of 1776. Even if John Adams himself got the date wrong, he was able to go ahead and predict correctly how it will be celebrated. He himself went ahead and said that there will be Americanish traditions and that they will be celebrated as one of the most national holidays ever. It was originally a working, non-paid holiday, unlike, until the 1900s, like the late 20th century, when it became a paid holiday. National holiday included as well, too. John Adams was correct. Nowadays, we go ahead and celebrate by eating American food, aka hot dogs. Who am I saying we? I'm not even American. This is the actual Declaration of Independence, which includes the Constitution. Note that this fancy calligraphy was not the original version of the Declaration of Independence. It was written in this way after they typed it up. The original signature was this. The British finally conceded defeat because, the French didn't exactly have the best navy in the world, but their land forces were destroyed by guerrilla tactics by the Americans, and they went ahead and made these peace treaties. They went ahead, wrote out this. America will give back Britain what it owes them, for war reparations. And Britain is all like, alright, hands off from you. I'm giving up on you colonies. You guys are on your own now. Bye. And now that George Washington was able to get his dream, and George Washington was able to defeat George III, hey, that's George versus George. They had to make a government, which sounds easier than it actually is. It's easier said than done. And they decided to go ahead and write the Constitution, which apparently lacked too much. It had several articles, but they were very ambiguous. So they added several more amendments, which is known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which includes freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, and the right to gather in public protesting, that kind of stuff. Later on we added more, but the first 10 are known as the Bill of Rights, mainly because they are talking about rights. One more thing, they had to go ahead and invent the government. They invented the checks and balances system, which would eventually evolve itself into a much stronger one, and they literally created the executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch. Note, the White House didn't exist until the second president of the United States, John Adams, was elected. George Washington didn't live in the White House because, well, it didn't exist. But one thing that no one has been able to break was George Washington's majority vote. George Washington is the first and currently only president in the about 250 years. It's currently 249, but next year will be 250. 250 years of existence. No one has ever been voted with 100% of the electoral college and the popular vote. Mainly because everyone was like, George Washington led us to war. George Washington was able to go ahead and win. George Washington himself never wanted the presidency. He wanted to retire in Mount Vernon. Or Mount Vermont, his home. But then everyone was like, you're the perfect president, guy. And, well, he just said, okay, fine, everyone wants me to become president. Sure, I'll be president. And he created the presidency itself. He created checks and balances on the president and all the powers of the president. He could have made it anything that he wanted to, which I kind of discuss in the U.S. government and politics episode, but that's a completely different story. He could have made it something like a king or your majesty or something like that, but he decided to go ahead and go with the title Mr. President. And he made up the rules, such as like 4-year terms and that you can only do 2 terms. Actually, he didn't make this rule, but he made this a tradition. Until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was tradition to just only do 2 terms, but there was nothing in the Constitution that went against you, like doing more than 2 terms. It just wasn't common. After Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to become president forever and was voted 4 times until he died of his disease, polio disease. After that, it was turned into law that only presidents can only take certain 2 terms, which kind of keeps the power in check and keeps people like DJT away from absolute power. When someone suggested, and pretty much everyone suggested, that George Washington become president for life, he insisted that this was not a good idea, and that he would have to retire. First of all, he's old. Second of all, he didn't want the presidency to become all-powerful king like Britain. We're not Britain, we're not Europe, we are Americans, and eventually we will become Canadians someday, but no, Canadians will never become Americans. At least not now, and nowhere in the near future. And that concludes our AP US history. Oh, and what happened to France? That's a completely different story. They had their own revolution, but not as clean. It had way more violence than the American Revolution. Guillotine. But this is AP US history. It's not AP, say, European history. That is it for today. I'll leave you with the words of John Adams. I already read this, so read this yourself. Until next time, Shihona, peace. Bye-bye.